insights or comments. So our first speaker for today's agenda is the Senior Manager with PU's Preventing Ocean Plastics project, which aims to propose strategies to reduce the global ocean plastic pollution problem. She has also worked on PU's International Conservation Unit, developing new projects and partnerships in Asia. Before joining PU, she was the Climate Change Science and Technology Advisor with the U.S. Agency for International Development's mission to Sri Lanka and the Maldives. Please welcome Winnie.
Thank you so much, Dave. And thank you so much for having me today. I'm honored to be here presenting to all of you. So please let me share my screen. So today I am going to talk to you about what it is going to take to break the plastic wave. And many of you are probably aware that the plastic pollution problem is pretty bad right now and is projected to accelerate and get much worse over the next few decades. But despite these projections, the plastic industry is projected to grow. It's projected to grow by about 40% over the next decade, and investment into the infrastructure for plastic production is also going to increase by about $400 billion. And then the growth for the ethylene market is also expected to grow by almost 9% in the next 10 years. Now, you probably have heard the stat that right now, the equivalent of about one garbage truckload of plastic is going into the ocean every minute. And that if we continue as we are, by the year 2050, there might be more plastic in weight than fish in the ocean. Those are pretty daunting numbers. So because of that, many different experts have been trying to propose different strategies for how we would solve this problem. There have been policies and proposals to ban plastic, maybe just to collect and burn them all or bury them in landfills. Some have proposed cleaning it up, taking it back out from the environment. Other groups have said we need to recycle as much as we can. And then the innovators out there are saying, no, there are new innovative solutions, particularly focusing on bio solutions. So, which of these strategies would work? How do they perform from an environmental, economic, and social perspective? And can they be applied to all materials, all plastic materials, and all geographies? And then what are the costs and investments that would be required to execute each of these strategies? So we, PU, and our partners set out to answer these questions about 3-4 years ago. We partnered with a consultancy called Systemic, based out of the UK. We partnered with the University of Oxford, the University of Leeds, the Ellen MacArthur Foundation, and Common Seas. And as a result of 2 years of intense effort involving 17 experts from around the world, we produced and published the report, Breaking the Plastic Wave, that was released last summer. And accompanying this report was a publication in the scientific journal Science. And what I'll be sharing with you today are the insights we learned from these analyses. So first off, what we found was that business as usual is going to become unmanageable. Over the next 2 decades, if we continue as we are, the amount of plastic waste that will be generated will double, and that will result in about 3 times more plastic going into the ocean each year than what is happening today. And then as a result, 4 times more plastic will be accumulating in the ocean over the next 2 decades. And what we also found out was that the current commitments made by governments and the private sector would only reduce the amount of plastic going into the ocean in the year 2040 by 7%. And these are commitments that have not yet actually been realized. So this is a projected reduction of 7%. Now, when we look at the different strategies I mentioned earlier, such as focusing on recycling or reducing and substituting away the plastic waste, or collecting and disposing of them safely, we found that even with tremendous effort over the next 20 years and tremendous investment, we would at best be keeping at about today's level. We would be keeping status quo while investing a lot of time, money, and effort. But there is hope. We found that there was one scenario where we could reduce away the amount of plastic pollution going into the ocean by over 80% over the next 20 years. And this we call the system change scenario. And it is a credible pathway. We looked at strategies and solutions that exist today. They may be at the early stages of development, but they do exist today. And we used various criteria that does involve some effort, but it is within the economics that consumers can bear. It is within the scaling rates that we have seen historically, for example. And this pathway would involve reducing about 30% of the plastic away through elimination, through new delivery systems, new design. It would also involve substituting away 17% of the plastic with compostable materials like paper and coated paper, for example. And we will have to also increase our recycling rate to 20% of the plastic that would be produced. And we would then collect and dispose of about 23% of the plastic that would be produced. But unfortunately, although we would be making tremendous gains in solving this problem, there would still be some plastic that is mismanaged and escape into the environment. But this is great improvement over what is projected under business as usual. Now, you can think about what it would actually mean from an economic perspective if we were to reduce by 80% the plastic pollution. And what we found is that the system change scenario, when we compare it to business as usual or the collect and dispose scenario or the recycling scenario, is actually the cheapest solution. I will have to caveat, this is the costs once the systems are in place. There will be some transition costs, but once the system is in place, it will actually cost government $70 billion less over the next 20 years implementing a system change approach. It would also lead to a lot less plastic pollution. We would also see gains in greenhouse gas emissions, and we would see about a 25% reduction in greenhouse gas emissions. And there would be a slight net gain in jobs, even though some of the sectors would be shifted, some of the jobs would be shifted to different sectors, but overall we would see a net gain in jobs. What this also means when we compare the business as usual scenario and also look at what governments are doing today in implementing new policies around plastics and shifting consumer preferences, is that the industry, the plastic industry, could be facing a financial risk that is 3 times its current profit in 2016, and might be at a risk of having to assume $100 billion of the cost in dealing with the plastic waste. So with the system change scenario, it looks good. And the question you might want to ask is, where do we go now? Where do we start? So the first thing that would be really important is to reduce plastic production and plastic waste generation. Plastic production, as I said earlier, it's projected to grow, and the projection is that it would triple by 2040 and be 4 times growth by 2050. And as you can see, plastic waste generation is also projected to grow per capita across all income levels and across all geographies. So how does this look in terms of the costs? When we look at the full value chain cost and of a ton of plastic, we found that reduction is the most economical, followed by recycling solutions. Disposal will always incur a cost because it costs money to collect the waste and put them into landfills. And switching to substituting to compostables and paper is actually rather costly, but there are some applications where this may make sense. So from a cost perspective, reduction is a very favorable solution, favorable approach. Now, of the reduction, what we need to do is to focus on the flexible and multi-material plastic. What we found is that there's a disproportionate amount of plastic pollution that is made up of flexible monomaterial plastics. So these are the plastic bags and the plastic films, and also the multi-layer and multi-material, so like the sachets. So even though these two types of plastic make up about 60% of the production, they make up almost 80% of what is found in the environment. So how do we do this? We need to switch to low waste solutions, such as going towards new refill and reuse business models, having low packaging design, as well as delivery systems that doesn't use single-use plastics. And here is an example of what the potential cost to consumers may be. As you can see, sachets and bottles are pretty costly to consumers, but we found that the economics is pretty favorable for new delivery models. So these are the refill systems, like this picture you see here. It's a little cart that goes to the communities, and community members can consumers can bring the bottles to the cart and refill just the product. So they're buying the product rather than buying the packaging and the product. So a second key area is that we need to close the waste collection gap, particularly in middle and low income countries. What we found is that about 2 billion people in the 2016 did not have access to waste management services. And this number is projected to grow to about 4 billion people in 2040. We estimated that if we were to connect all the people that do not have waste management services by the year 2040, we would have to add about 500,000 people per day. We would have to connect them to services. So that's 500,000 people per day. It's a rather daunting number. When we look at why that's the case, we can see that a lot of it has to do with capital investments in waste management. When we look at waste management, virgin plastic production is actually 10 times greater than what we invest in waste management. Another connection with closing the waste collection gap is that we're going to have to reduce plastic waste export and import, particularly between high-income countries and low-income countries. And global waste export is projected to grow almost double in the next 20 years. The next thing to think about is recycling and what the economics of recycling tell us about what is feasible. So today, 15% of the plastic is recycled globally. And part of it is driven by the economics. The cost of recycled plastic pellets actually is greater than the cost of virgin plastic pellets. And when we look at the costs associated with collecting and sorting plastic for recycling, we can see here that only a very small percentage, the rigid plastic, clear plastic, maybe the colored bottles, these are the drinking water bottles, only that small percentage is actually economically viable for mechanical recycling today. Almost all of the other types of plastics are economically not viable because it costs much more to collect and sort them than you can get from selling the recycled plastic pellets. And then another thing to consider is with all the discussions happening in Glasgow right now, that different solutions have different greenhouse gas emissions. As you can see, if you get rid of the plastic altogether, you're not generating greenhouse gas emissions from the plastic. And then as you go to different types of strategies, you would be adding to the greenhouse gas emissions. And of course, what we're seeing, what we saw is that the reuse models will be the least greenhouse gas emissions. And then the open burn that might happen in many places that don't have waste management services, that generates quite a bit of greenhouse gas emissions. Then the last thing I want to raise to your attention is that microplastic pollution is something that's going to need a lot of attention. That the amount is projected to more than double, and the main generator of microplastic pollution is in high-income countries. What we found is that almost 80% of the microplastic pollution is being generated by tire dust as cars are being driven on roads. And microplastic is a problem because once the plastic goes into the environment, it's really difficult to collect them. If we cannot collect the big pieces of plastic, we're going to have a very, very hard time collecting the tiny pieces of plastic. And there are studies that are now starting to understand the impacts of microplastic pollution. For example, there was a study that found that a chemical found in tire dust particles affected the salmon in the Pacific Northwest of the US, where it actually caused the salmon to die. So we need to think about how we're understanding microplastic pollution and how to minimize microplastic pollution. And then finally, I'll close with a more inspirational and positive outlook. And that is that we can get to zero leakage of plastic, but it will require innovation. Here are just some examples of innovation that's already happening in the world, where we can have barrier performance replacement with coating on food products, for example, instead of wrapping the fruit and the food in plastic. We can also design packaging-free alternatives, use bio-friendly, compostable, biodegradable materials, have collection points that are distributed, and advanced sorting and recycling facilities. So with that, I'm going to close, and thank you so much for your attention, and I look forward to your questions.
You already have a lot of them, Winnie, in the chat box. But I would just like to say this was a gold mine of a talk. A lot of very useful insights that you have shared, especially how it looks like. One quote that really stuck with me the most is that business as usual will not be manageable in the future. So thank you again, Winnie, for that perspective. You have a lot of questions. We will try, and also, by the way, your voice is so soothing. It's as if I was listening to Headspace. The problem isn't so overwhelming when you're presenting it. You were very, I think that's a good attitude to have as well, to be able to calmly look at the scenarios and see where it works. Anyway, I've cut myself short here. I want to hear your answers to these questions. Winnie, we'll try a rapid fire style Q&A, meaning just quick answers to these questions. So first one, Okay, great questions, by the way. All right, let's start here. What do you see in being successful in terms of economic incentives or disincentives to encourage alternatives to plastic?
So one of the things we found is that we're going to need everything. Like don't leave anything off the table. Will some strategies be more applicable and effective in different situations? Yes. I think you have to look at your situations, specific situation, like the government, the private sector, and consumers, and what each group is willing to do in a specific country or in a specific region. That said, both incentives and disincentives are being used all over the world. And, many places are putting in place bag bans, for example, or there are extended producer responsibility schemes. These are all, you can say, incentives and disincentives, like the bag fee. And there is evidence that they do work. And I think we need more understanding of how and what situations they are most effective.
Yeah, and that's also a good intersection of behavioral science as well, like how we respond to these incentives and disincentives that are already in place. So I know you've covered some parts that touch the answers to this question, but in summary, what is the system change scenario in an operational or project level way? That's from Steve.
It's a very good question. So in essence, it's about looking at the connections between different parts of the system. So for example, a very good example is if you only focus on increasing recycling rate, for example, without thinking about whether there is a market for that recycled plastic, then you're not closing the loop. You're not having that circular economy perspective. So the system change scenario is really looking at how the entire system is connected. So you start by looking at the product that you're making. How is it designed? Is it designed such that it actually can be recycled? Now, if you actually look deeper, can it be recycled where it's actually being consumed? Because it could be manufactured in one country where in that country it can be recycled, but then once it is shipped overseas, it could go to markets that cannot be recycled. Can we design the product so that's easier, cheaper to recycle? It's much harder to recycle and much more costly to recycle products that have multiple different types of plastic stuck together. So can we think about designing packaging that can be easily recyclable? Even better, can we design packaging that can be used multiple times? So you don't even have to think about recycling to begin with. But to have that, have the recycling, to have the reuse systems in place, you also have to work with government. Is there local infrastructure that can allow for the products, the packaging, the bottles to be reused? Are there laws that prevent that? Like, so for example, there are some laws in the US that prevent reuse of certain containers because there are hygiene laws that prevent that. So the system change scenario is about looking at which solutions would be effective in the jurisdiction that you're looking at, but really also thinking about how they're all connected so that you can get the biggest bang for your buck.
Thank you, Winnie. And by the way, the question was from Gidon Florentino. Thank you so much. We have a lot more in the chat, Winnie, but we will send it to you, and shortly our team will be circulating the answers as well to everyone, especially to those who've asked the questions. Thank you so much for the insights. So sorry that that's all the time we have for today with you, but I'm sure I will want to hear more from you and your insights as well. Thank you so much, Winnie.
Thank you so much for having me and for great questions.
I agree. So to continue with closing the circle for this sprint series, this session on plastics, purpose, and the private sector, our next speaker has been a sustainability consultant for over 10 years. He has been working with some of the region's iconic brands, primarily in the transportation, hospitality, and construction sectors, to help them develop and implement strategies around carbon reduction, waste, and recycling. Interestingly, he was raised on a dairy farm in New Zealand, and we will let you know why it's interesting for us. He brings with him his land surveying and engineering expertise, as well as his experience in delivering experiential leadership learning programs on sustainability. Please welcome, to speak about exploring plastics purpose in a green business, Dr. Marion Pierce.
Thank you, Harvey, and hopefully people are hearing me okay. So please just let me know. After my technology challenges, I've ended up in the park across the road. So enjoy the sound of the background birds and also the traffic. I'm hoping that's all going nicely for everyone. My sound's coming through. Thank you Gabs for moving the slides along. Yes, this is going to be a fun discussion following some really good information that Winnie's shared with us. There's a lot of questions, a lot of things that I'd like to explore myself there, because it touches on really important questions. You have to understand the baselines, and hopefully out of the examples I share today, you will see that. So next slide, please, Gab. So we're going to do a very brief introduction to the purpose business, who I consult through. A couple of personal drivers so you can understand what my personal drivers or interests in this topic are and where they come from, and then getting into some real business examples that I've had. The Purpose Business is a network of consultants headquartered in Hong Kong, but working across Asia with a number of high brands that people may have heard of. And what I love about this network of people is that it's all about what's the purpose we're trying to achieve, what's the goal that we're going forward with. And so through these clients that we've worked with in the property industries, hospitality, transportation, investment, education, and also with a number of NGOs, is a very interesting broad range of experiences and questions, and also solutions and challenges. So the next slide is, let's kind of set a little bit of scene about exploring plastics and the purpose of plastic, because I want to look at the actual objectives. And plastics, you might say, has had a pretty bad name or pretty bad rap over the last 5 or 10 years. And I don't think it's all warranted for just plastic, because it's more about people and how we use plastic than plastic itself. So I want to look at some examples that we're saying where plastic is actually the better option. We shouldn't be banning plastic in some cases. What is problematic plastic, and where does that definition of problematic come from? Which perspective? And then the issue of returnable packaging and how it's assessed against single-use packaging, and whether that single-use packaging may be better or not than returnable. It depends on our metrics that we're using. So into a personal background briefly. So as Harvey mentioned at the start, I was raised on a dairy farm in New Zealand with nature, growing up with animals, seeing life cycles, the things growing, things passing away. And there was an earthquake. The corner of our farm dropped 2.05 meters. So if you put your hand up and reach the roof, that's about the height that the land dropped. Now, with this whole topic of climate change, and this area was close to the sea, we actually noticed the drain at the back of our farm now having tidal influence where it didn't. So I got interested in the environment from a measurement perspective, did a surveying degree, and through that surveying degree, got to travel a lot. So this picture you're seeing on the screen is actually me at South Pole, where we're measuring ice accumulation and rates of movement to do with trying to see what's happening on glaciers. I also got involved with many projects around restoring forests and wildlife in those places. And that got me to places where I saw that New Zealand could be doing it better, Fiji could be doing it better, and then now being in Asia for 12 years, I'm seeing different ways that we can do things in places like Hong Kong and in the region. So it really got me excited about air pollution, waste in the broader sense, and the challenge of when we get to recycling. As Winnie mentioned, recycling is one step, it's not the solution all the time. So let's move on to the next slide. And we're really saying the question I want to explore with you today, and hopefully one that you'll take away, is what is the problem that you're really trying to solve so that we can put the right solutions in place, or asking the right questions so that we can see the options. So one of the things we came up with in the purpose business is what we call is the waste wheel. Now we're looking at this in the sense of waste, and you can look at this from the perspective of plastics, like we are talking about today. So we've heard that there's the production phase. How do we actually redesign products? How do we make products with the plastics? And then you've got the different choices of materials. I'll come back to some of the choices of materials. Then we get into the phase of what's happening at the consumption phase. Between that, you've got the supply chain plastic that's moving the products. So it might be the shrink wrap around the outside of boxes on a pallet. And then when we get that consumption phase, whether it be an individual or private scenario, then what happens to that material? Winnie pointed out the perfect example, what might be locally recycled and you're able to deal with in your area where the product gets sold and used, it mightn't be appropriate. So then what is the appropriate disposal options that you have available at that spot? And ideally, you're going to have separated out what's got value and what's useful in the collection phase. And that leads us back into the circular economy of how do we get materials back into reuse, whether that is paper, metal, or plastics. So the circular economy is really about avoiding what's waste or stuff that nature can't deal with naturally. So we'll move into the next slide. And when you start thinking about that last waste wheel slide, you can use that for plastics. And you start thinking, well, plastic, yes, there's plastic waste. Or are we actually talking about waste in general? Because if you switch from plastic to another material, then can that paper or that metal or that composite bamboo, glue, whatever it's made of, can be dealt with locally. And then you start going, well, is it actually the waste, things washing up on a beach or being in a stream, that's the problem? Or is it even bigger challenges? How are we going to reduce our CO2 emissions and what solutions fit with a climate change model going ahead in 10 years or 20 years from now? So think of what the base question is, and then go back up the tree asking, is there a more important question that if we make the wrong choice, we're going to end up with a consequence that we weren't planning to have? So on the next slide, we've got this wonderful fruit bowl of choices that I've outlined to you. And so I'm going to give 3 examples about, one's going to come from the airline industry, where they had the challenge around water-soluble plastics. Another one is going to be from the hotel industry, and that's going to be how do we empower staff to actually get involved? And the other one is choice of packaging. So for the airline industry, the purpose business project, so we're just on this slide, Gabs, there's no more, we're just going to talk through this slide. For the airline industry, we were engaged to look at an issue around water-soluble plastics. And what it was that the issue of banning single-use plastics had come up. Airline industry, we know, uses a lot of single-use plastic. And things like blankets and headsets were in a plastic bag. And people were saying, hang on, why are we doing this? And one of the solutions was switching from a normal raw oil-based plastic to a plant-based plastic that had actually been made in a way that it was water-soluble. And then the question became, well, okay, this is water-soluble plastic in an airline. An airline's a pretty closed environment. We get on it, we fly somewhere, or we used to fly somewhere, and we get off, and very little of that waste or recyclables actually leave the plane with passengers. Most of it's in their waste management system. So very few pieces of this plastic were likely to end up on a beach or in a waterway. So when we think about biodegradable plastic, if it's still going to be going into the normal recycling system that the airline had, was switching to this biodegradable plastic going to pollute the other plastics that they were collecting and make the recycling more difficult? The end answer became that it was actually not the question of which type of plastic we had, was we could be changing the plastic bags or the cutlery to some other materials. So then they started looking at, do we change from a biodegradable plastic to, say, an aluminium or a bamboo set of cutlery? But those cutlery items made of those items were sometimes 20 to 100% heavier. And of course, you'll all know that airline industry, their biggest challenge at the moment is the amount of fuel that they're burning at high altitude, creating CO2 emissions. So they chose in the end to stay with a normal type of plastic that they already knew was able to be recycled with other materials that they were collecting, and make sure they collected it, rather than going away from the plastic material and going to another material which was going to be heavier and increase their CO2 emissions. So what started as one question almost ended up meaning we ended up having to redefine what is the main decision process or main problem that we're trying to address at a corporate board level. And the CO2 one came in as being a lot more important than just changing the plastic. But of course, you still ended up with the challenge of having to discuss that with the board members and other corporate members. Now, in the hotel situation, similarly, a lot of hotels have plastic amenity bottles and straws and cups like that. And when we first started the discussion with this company, the issue was, do we ban plastic straws and change it to paper straws? Well, the question really is, do you need the straw at all? So this chain went to all their locations around the world and reviewed the drinks and said, okay, some of these drinks do not need a straw in them at all. So it was able to totally eliminate any form of material. So that was a good one in itself. But then staff were saying, well, for the plastics that we still get, what is good plastic and what is bad plastic? They were looking at plant-based plastics or oil-based plastics as well. But you may realize that certain types of plastic can't be easily recycled. And things like black plastic is also a challenge. And so that color of the plastic means it's unable to be made into clear plastic again. So it's hard to recycle like for like, i.e. if you've got a clear plastic bottle and you mix it with some black plastic, you're going to get a gray material and you're not going to be able to actually recreate a plastic bottle that's clear. So they started looking at their plastic bottles and deciding what color they would be. So they went clear and did labeling there so that it meant that they could collect them, the recycler could recycle them, and it could be reused again in a more circular way. And they also came up with 3 different ways of classifying plastics. There was plastics that were going to be banned, plastics that they could go and get approval for use. Now, plastic is polystyrene. The expanded polystyrene is a challenge, we know. So they were trying to eliminate polystyrene and PVC from their supply chain. Some things are still made with that are just the most efficient way. So they gave staff the choice that if you can't get rid of it, at least try and minimize how much you're buying. And then the third level was for other types of plastics that are locally recyclable, you can actually just use those. Now, they didn't say what types they were, because in different parts of the world, there was different types of plastics that would be easily recyclable or difficult to recycle. And the last one, which might actually, a dairy farmer brought up with having milk coming in a glass bottle. Then the other part was when milk bottles changed to paper cartons. So I got involved with a beverage company here, looking at big plastic refillable water containers to whether they were going to consider switching those to be single use. Because the single use was a lighter plastic. It was a type of plastic that was more easily to be recycled locally. But there was the public perception that if you're going from a reusable plastic to a single-use plastic, you were going against the trend. And the trend we know is to try and have more reusable models being used in all parts of the economy. And they were lucky enough that they already had a glass bottling plant. So they could actually up the production of their glass returnable bottles that were refilled and renew their bottling line for the plastic bottles in the refillable bottles. So in the end, they looked at it and went from a public perception perspective. There was the challenge of what type of packaging could be handled and what was the public expecting, even if it was going to cost them some more. So I've just listed a number of different questions there because those three different examples give you what's your main problem that you're trying to solve, what solution is going to give staff the chance to actually work on it and feel as though they're part of solving it and not having to go back to management or specialists. And those specialists may not know the right answers. And then which packaging type is going to be the most lightweight, easy to use for your environment. So at that point, I'll move on to the last slide, which is thank you. And I look forward to some questions.
Thank you, Marion. We'd like to know, in your experience working with the private sector, what would be the most surprising concern that you've learned when they transition to a circular economy model?
Biggest concern towards going to a circular economy model?
Yes.
Yes. It's often the perception it's going to cost them more money. So it then becomes over what time frame you look at. Of course, if you look at the short term, yes, you might have an increased cost. But over the long term, what's that worth to your brand value and less hassles with your product washing up on beaches or being left on the side of parks and things like that. So it comes down to being a risk management exercise as much as being a materials question. And this is where if you're a company that's happy to be at that late developing stage, then you're going to use sachets which are made of plastic and 3 layers of sachet plastic that is very hard to recycle. Practically no one uses it because it's easier to put a drink in a sachet than it is to put a drink in a bottle and bring it back because of all those supply chain issues and carbon emission issues. So there's lots of things to look in your brand awareness. And that's the part that you find with companies. Someone will say, we've got to ban all plastic. And you go, really? You mean the plastic chair in this meeting room? Or do you just mean the wrapping around the box? So again, set the words carefully to what your goal is and what you're trying to save.
Thank you. So we also have a question in the chat about if you could outline the key steps that you go through when a company, that you go through with a company that you engage with.
In terms of looking at plastic packaging, that type of thing, it's like most things there's a baseline of data. So how much is there? What types of plastic have you got? Which of those products are your own brand products that you have some design control over? And which are the products you're dealing with that is going to be more complicated to work with? And then it becomes a case of bringing together the design team and the marketing team and often the investor relations people, because they're the ones that are hearing the feedback from customers and saying, okay, we're not going to achieve all of the expectations from those 3 different sectors, but how do we rank them? And then what's our message to actually tell them why we've chosen one choice over another? That's the kind of journey. I hope that answers that question nicely.
What about targets? How do you set good targets?
Once you have good baseline information to be able to monitor and report on them. Because setting a target with not knowing in 2 years or 5 years how you're going to say, hey, we missed it because this was the issue and this is why we missed it. No problem with missing the target if you can prove and say why it was missed and what you've done to alleviate the problem. So targets are good, but don't get caught on setting targets for target's sake and ones that don't make sense to your company. You've got to make sure it's fit for your industry and company. So don't get worried about, oh, these guys are banning single-use plastic. It's like, well, they probably shouldn't have had single-use plastic in the first place if they're targeting that. Are they banning other packaging? So those kind of questions that you work in and say, that's how we'll measure it, and targets that you can get staff buy-in, because without staff buy-in and commitment, they're not going to explore and give other suggestions and broader issues in that. So that's the real key part. It's a team collaboration.
Marion, thank you so much for your time today and for giving us insights on plastics and purpose and also the private sector. Thank you for being with us today. And we will be circulating the presentation of the two speakers and also their contact information.